We'll go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, welcome to our session, C3 Climate, COVID, and Community. My name is Dr. Batsirai Bonzalbaya. I am a staff psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania's Counseling Center, and I'm also the Director of Outreach and Prevention Services. And I'm gonna pause and let my colleagues introduce themselves. Beth, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'm Beth Mark, one of the psychiatrists at CAPS. I'm particularly interested in how the environment affects our mental health. So we're going to talk a lot today about the negative impacts when the environment is in disorder. But I just want to put a plug for the opposite side of the coin, which is that the environment, nature, our human environment, can create profound healing as well. And we'll get to some of those resources at the end. So we have to keep that balance as we tip a little bit on the hard stuff today as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Marian Rafe and I'm the assessment specialist at CAPS. I evaluate and implement outreach and prevention programs. I'm also a social worker and I have a background in public health focusing on psychosocial and cultural contexts of health and healthcare. So I'll be talking a little bit about how these three interrelated pandemics might affect our mental and physical health.
Thank you both for doing that. And again, you know, we're going to talk a lot about, you know, some really difficult content, and we have some pictures here today. So if anything that we share feels upsetting or feels difficult for you, of course, feel free to step out in the ways that you need. And if you need any support from Beth, Marian, and I, please let us know through the private chat. But as Beth said, I think one of the things that feels so important about this conversation is, you know, there are things that we can do, and there are aspects of this that we can really participate and make changes and hopefully move in a better direction than where we are when we're thinking about these three pandemics. So we're excited that you're here and you know, interested in engaging in this conversation. So we're gonna present some content, and I think there'll be parts where we're gonna ask for some interactions and have conversation. And then we're hoping that we'll actually, you know, roughly present for about 45 minutes to an hour or so. But of course, again, they'll be interactive, and then leave the last 30 minutes just for more dialogue and questions and comments, just because we feel like there's so much wisdom in this room, and I think it'll be great for us to just exchange that and hear what people are doing and hear the insights that they have as well. So yeah, without further ado, we'll just get started here. Just to make sure you are in the right place, expecting you know, the right things. In this workshop, we're going to discuss the impact of, you know, COVID, climate, and community on mental health. Obviously, we each have expertise in mental health, but we're also all trained slightly different. And I think that's one of the things that's been great about, you know, preparing for this workshop is we each bring sort of our own expertise and our own lens. And that I think has actually helped this presentation really come together in a really great way. We're also hoping that we're going to describe some of the interconnections between these three pandemics and really talk about how they overlap, but also how the solutions are related to some of the problems that we are currently facing. And last but not least, we're going to discuss the value of building caring communities and resilience as we are approaching all three pandemics and thinking a lot about the work that we can do to, again, build resilience within our communities. So I just wanted to start off with a quote, because I think this is going to inform a lot of what we talk about, in that even though we're going to talk about the three pandemics separately, we're also going to talk about how they impact each other. So we really wanted to introduce this lens as we're thinking about how all of these things inform each other. So Dr. Mark wrote a really great article, and the link is included below. But there was this quote that I thought was just really powerful, which was one of the central insights of those in the field of climate change is that the scientific and psychological challenges confronting the climate crisis cannot be severed from politics, economics, ethics, and even religion. And I feel like it really speaks to how even though we can think about these things differently, and of course, maybe think about taking action in one area versus another, essentially taking action in one area actually leads to a domino effect in taking action in other areas as well. And again, the solutions can only come from us looking at the big picture together, as opposed to sort of staying siloed and thinking about what moving forward can look like, because everything is so interconnected. And I thought this quote really does a good job of representing that. One of the other things too about what we're currently witnessing is, unlike most traumas, when we think about them, we can think about them as past distinct events that's already happened and things that, we're now coping with. But one of the things that makes it challenging about, climate, COVID, and, systemic racism is that these are sort of ongoing future threats. And that's part of where the distress can come from for us, because we're not only thinking about things that have happened in the past, but we're still thinking about how to deal with this ongoing, unfolding crisis for all three issues. And that's part of what can make building resilience challenging. But it's, again, part of what makes it important for us to have this conversation, to really think about how do we equip ourselves, given that we are still dealing with these issues and will continue to deal with them for a while. So we're just going to go ahead and start off by talking a little bit about the first C, which is talking about climate change. And Beth is going to lead us in that discussion before we transition into talking about the other two C's.
Thank you, Batsi. So yeah, there are a lot of negative impacts on mental health due to climate change. And they're complicated impacts because they can be direct and indirect. They can be short-term and long-term. They can be immediate and delayed. So lots of different timing factors. And then we add the layers, which gets us into the C3, that there is a whole range of vulnerability in terms of how individuals are impacted. So there are biologic factors, for instance, age or pre-existing conditions. And there are social, economic, cultural factors and forces such as systemic racism, which add a whole other layer of the intensity of the impact in terms of climate change and mental health. So to try to break it down a little bit, if we look at the direct effects, so these are the neuroinflammatory, direct on the brain kind of effects, there's increasing evidence that suggest if we separate out the other factors as best we can, that increases in temperature and air pollution show increased rates of aggression and violence in people, as well as increased rates of mood disorders and suicide. If we think about acute and chronic stress responses from exposures to extreme weather events, so the hurricane, the wildfires, there are increased incidents of post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as increased rates of depression and anxiety. So I think we're familiar with the stress response from a traumatic event. I think the evidence showing how it affects our brains, in addition to our lungs and other things, when bad stuff happens in terms of the air and the environment, that's a kind of increasingly important area of research and area for us to be aware of. Batsi, next slide, thank you. Let's look at some of the indirect effects, and this may speak to, some of us more today secure in Philly, and hopefully not next to an oil refinery right now. So these are some of the things that many people are commenting that they're feeling as the environment around them changes, and or they are just reading and realizing what climate change means. So as these descriptors are, just an increased sense of helplessness, hopelessness, fatalism, a loss of so many things, future, control, direction, changes in personal relationships and ways that people interact in communities. Again, maybe not so obvious at first glance in our community, but if you think about communities where there is much more connection to, for instance, agriculture or the sea, or cultures where the life and customs are very much tied to snow. Everything starts to fall apart when this foundation suddenly is disappearing. The identity of the culture and the people dissolves in some ways, like the snow, and it's incredibly traumatic. And then there's compounded stress from, as we mentioned, changing environment, but eco-migration. This speaks a little bit to point B, but basically that loss of social custom and cohesion and resource scarcity, which creates, again, another level of anxiety, stress, and it adds in one of these more indirect ways to hostility, violence, and interpersonal and intergroup aggression, unlike the neuroinflammatory effects that I mentioned in the previous slide. Next slide. It's interesting, there's a whole vocabulary of terms and descriptors that are emerging kind of from the atmosphere, you know, to try to capture what people are feeling these days. So none of these are disorders in any kind of diagnostic manual, at least at this point. But they're used by clinicians, by journalists, by just regular people to try to capture what they're feeling. So eco-distress is a good umbrella term, right? It sort of captures everything from anxiety to depression to anger to despair. And I think it's important to just highlight that none of these descriptors, and in fact, feeling terribly upset about all of these things, climate, COVID, racism, none of this is abnormality. None of these are diagnosable problems. None of these are disorders. These are very natural and normal responses to real threats. And it can be a real threat that's right in front of you, or it can be a real threat to one's future if you really look at the data and the facts and you think about what's coming down the pike. Eco-anxiety, I think, is the most used term. So it certainly captures a fear of the future, of environmental doom. Another strong feeling is grief, right? The grief of real loss of a home or a community if you've been exposed to some of the repercussions of climate change, or the grief of a future that you thought you'd have because things aren't going the way that they were supposed to because of these large problems. You know, I think about the scientists that are studying particular species, for example, and they see them dying out and they see their life's work just dissolving, right? So there's many things to be grieving. And I'll point out also that it seems natural and normal that any of us have all of these and we rotate back and forth. It's not like, you know, you get one and that's it. I think this is a very fluid process. And you know, as we take our emotional temperature, to be aware that, again, all of this huge range of emotion is normal, painful, but normal. Next slide.
So this is a photo taken in California last week. And we want to just start to have a little bit of interaction with everybody on this Zoom call and ask you what your reactions are to seeing this image. And you can write these in the chat. I'll just, while you're thinking about that, I'll take a moment to explain why we selected this image. So we used it partly to represent not just the fires, which are related to the climate, but the multiple crises that are occurring in the United States and globally this year. And also, it shows a bridge going into an unknown, uncertain place in the future. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but also there might be possibility, as there is in the image of a bridge. For example, possibility for building bridges. So we'll give you a minute or two to write your responses, and then we'll see if anybody wants to share or if we can have a little bit more interaction around this. So just starting to summarize a little bit of what I'm seeing in the chat. Some of the responses are like what Dr. Mark mentioned about just feeling like heart sinking. It's a kind of depression, terrified, feeling afraid, anxious, and also shocked, sadness, and a kind of a sense of unreality. Like, could this really be happening? It doesn't feel quite real. So that's what I'm seeing. Are there any other reactions or comments or thoughts about not just this particular image, but where we might be heading? Like any thoughts about what this bridge makes you think of, perhaps? It's very emotionally charged responses, and just want to remind people that this is a challenging conversation. So please do take care of yourselves, take a deep breath right now. And if you need to just stretch a little bit, come back to feeling your feet on the floor, get grounded, and then we'll continue on with the next slide when you're ready.
Mary and Beth here. You know, I just wanted to comment that one of the things that this picture, I've seen it a couple of times now, but it makes it feels so uncertain. To me, it's precarious and uncertain, right? Like we're sort of hanging there and we don't know where we're going, and we don't know if we're heading to all those lights, which seem pretty foreboding, or if we're racing away from them to some place that may be safer. And I think that's one of the things that, I mean, it does feel a little safer to me to be to the left side of the picture, feels sort of clearer. So, you know, it just seems like just a real illustrative way to be thinking about, again, going back and forth in terms of emotion. And seriously, I think, you know, acknowledging that things are precarious right now. I'll take the little out. I'll be brave, right? And things are precarious. We need to figure out where we are and how to find safety and how to find balance and how to navigate the uncertainty. And I think that's one of the, you know, or two of the really key things going back to psychological resilience in this time. It's being able to get comfortable with uncertainty, and also cultivating ways to really find our balance, even when we're on the bridge.
I think that's what we're going to be looking at throughout. As Dr. Mark said, we have some pretty tough information, but it's important to acknowledge where we are and be real. And I think yeah, it looks like a science fiction movie, but I think part of it is that it's not. And part of acknowledging that reality is where do we find our strength? Where do we find the strength to move from here, knowing where we are right now? So I think we can maybe move on, and hopefully we'll answer these questions as we get towards the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Marion. I just wanted to share as we transition from that image. I think when I looked at that image, initially sort of similar to the reactions that other people have shared, it does feel shocking. It almost didn't feel real. And I think one of the things I started to think about was the people, right? The people who lived in those areas, the people that had to move out of those areas, and then of course, some of the essential workers that have to move into those areas to help contain everything, right? So it's just kind of really thinking about when I've looked at images like this, or images of the South with flooding and the storms, and just really thinking about what does evacuation look like in COVID times, right? Like, how do people sort of keep themselves safe, from COVID, while also trying to flee from another sort of threat in terms of, water or fire damage, right? So just really thinking about all the impact that has on people, and then of course the people who try to help those people who are fleeing these areas, and just thinking about, again, how much all of these crises end up really impacting each other in pretty significant ways. So as we transition to talking more specifically about COVID, we just wanted to start off by acknowledging broad themes and then talking specifically about some of the mental health themes. So the first is just thinking a lot about, there's so much uncertainty that we're all holding. I initially, when the pandemic started, I think I initially thought that, it's going to be, a few weeks, maybe a few months, but, I felt like I could already see where the finish line was. And I think as obviously things continue to unfold, really realizing that I had to come to terms with a sense of uncertainty that this was going to be with us, much longer. And it wasn't necessarily, just having to be hopeful in that moment, but really thinking about what does endurance look like during this time, because this was something that we were going to be living with for a while and try to figure out how to contain over time. But those feelings of uncertainty can be hard. When and how is it going to be contained? What does containment look like? Who is going to be vulnerable within our communities, and thinking about how to continue to protect each other. And then, of course, thinking about the economic and psychological losses due to the pandemic. When there is financial, stress within a community, we do worry about the mental health impacts of that, and really thinking about how people will cope during that time, especially, again, if the stressor continues, right? Which with COVID, we're seeing sort of the enduring qualities of it, and then thinking about how do we endure that as people, as we're suffering through some of those economic and psychological losses. And as we'll talk about in a second, this is not impacting us in the same ways, right? Some people are feeling more of the burden than others. So for example, I'm fortunate enough to have a job where I can work remotely and still, manage to stay engaged and sort of do my work. But as all of you know, that's not the case for everybody. And I think that's part of the challenge with COVID, as well as the other pandemics we're going to talk about today. And then last, just thinking about the uncertainty of whether new diseases will emerge, related to climate factors. So again, as we are thinking about intervention, really starting to think too about prevention, like how do we sort of think about what this could look like in the future, and are there other threats that we need to anticipate and start to sort of make changes now in order to prevent those from affecting us, especially as we think about COVID. So again, I think being in that state of trying to do both at the same time can be pretty challenging. And as we think about COVID, what does it mean for the pandemic to be contained? What will normal look like once we get there, right? How are we thinking about that? How is it changing our ways of living and learning, relating to each other? All things that I think for a while we sort of took for granted in terms of how we could connect with each other and function in the world. And what is it going to look like after this? So again, more uncertainty, and sort of thinking again about that image of the bridge. There is the sense of moving towards uncertainty, and at the same time also seeing possibilities and hope. for us to move in a different direction and hopefully towards safety for everybody. As I mentioned earlier, this slide is, talking a little bit more about COVID-19 and mental health. And again, trying to list some of the ways that this pandemic has had impact. We've all had, I think, to some degree, a range of emotional discomfort, ranging from maybe sadness, frustration, loneliness, grief, just around all of the things that have taken place in each of our lives. So here's a very short list of some of the things that felt really salient to us, but again, I'm sure we could add to these as well. So just navigating issues around space and technology, and really navigating new learning and working environments. And for some folks, really trying to juggle your work environment or your learning environment with your family environment simultaneously, and really feeling pulled in so many different directions and trying to figure out how to balance both and try to be effective at both. And again, that takes a lot of energy to do, that takes a lot of internal resources to do, while maybe you're also thinking about how to keep people within your community safe from catching COVID, especially if you have to be in the community to some degree and you're not able to isolate or don't have the resources to do that. So just again, thinking about all these changes we've had to make. Again, thinking about financial stressors and then the layers of loss associated with that. I think, for students, through our work, having conversations about what it feels like to not, finish your senior year or your, graduate career in the ways that you had envisioned, or now really thinking whether you should look for a job or stay in school this upcoming year because, the opportunities for jobs may be limited, or really thinking about experiences with family and friends that have been lost and really thinking about how to maintain some of those connections. So, people having parties, weddings, all sorts of activities planned that are either now on hold or sort of were held, but in a very different way than what was imagined. So thinking a little bit about those layers of loss and how to cope with that. The other thing I think that's really specific to students is thinking about the change in life plans. I think one of the things that I think Mary and Beth and I enjoy about working on a college campus is you really get to see people in various stages of development. That can be such an exciting time, such an important time where, you're sort of in the middle of this self-discovery, getting to meet new people, just really getting to engage in such an important time in your lives. And I think sometimes that has felt really sad in thinking about the impact that COVID has had, where there's been, for most students, a change in life plans. So even maybe evacuating your home, during the semester and then having to restart learning, or, having been on spring break plans that, you had to come back home or sort of had to stay there or figure out how to get back. And then of course for international students, for some not knowing when they can go home or things like that, or having to be in isolation when they get home. So there's just been all of these changes in life plans that I think have been pretty significant when we think about the impact that's had on students, especially in each of the stages of development that they're currently in right now. Of course, we also, do not want to overlook that, people have lost family and friends either due to other illnesses or due to COVID. And that's also been really challenging. I know that for me, when I watch the news and sometimes seeing that ticker with the number of people that have gotten COVID and the people that have died, it really does have impact. I think each time just seeing that number continue to rise and thinking about the worldwide impact. And of course, thinking about each of us experiencing that across the world also has a lot of impact, that it's not just something that is experienced here, it's something that we're seeing everywhere. And I think that is true when we think about all three pandemics, is again, it's not just within the US that we see some of these trends, it's across the world, right? It's almost like we really are in it together, not just based on where you live or your experiences. This really does cut across so many different communities and experiences. Some other things we want to mention is just really noticing some of the difficulty maintaining self-care, increased senses of isolation and loneliness. And then last but not least, this is such a big point that I think we could talk a lot about, which is the exacerbation of mental health conditions and tapping into the history of traumas for some of us within our communities, right? Marion's going to talk more about that soon when we talk about the community impact, but Again, all of these things really impact us significantly as a community, but they also don't impact us exactly the same way. And it's not necessarily saying one is more important than the other. It's just the recognition of that impact is so important, so that we are making sure that we are providing support, adequate support to the people who need more support, especially when we think about our communities of color or poor communities that are really impacted in such different ways, which again, we'll talk about soon. So again, we wanted to provide these two images because I think it's so important that as we're talking about so many of the difficulties that we've encountered, that we're also recognizing the resilience and ability for us as human beings to adapt. And I notice it within myself, I notice it within my nieces and nephews that, sometimes now it almost feels strange like leaving the house without a mask, or sort of not really sort of thinking about, like washing hands consistently, or being really careful about proximity with other people. So as human beings, we do have this amazing ability to adapt and adjust. And I think, again, that's where a lot of like my hope resides, is just thinking about how we're able to sort of adjust and figure out how to support each other as we need. So again, looking at these two images, if you feel comfortable just writing in the chat, what are some of your reactions to these two images? So the first one is of a protester. This happened in June in London. And it's a protester who identifies as being Black, carrying a white counter-protester to safety. And I think this is an image that I believe went viral. And just talking again about the nuances in all these issues that we talk about in terms of some of the divisions that might exist, but also the opportunities for community building. The second photograph is somebody named Poet Taylor, who's distributing hundreds of meals, and this was April 1st in DC. And again, really thinking about serving people in need, that even though all of us are afraid to go out, and this can be a really scary time, there are people that are going out and serving us and helping us get through this time. And of course, putting their own safety at risk in order to do that. And the same is true when we think about protesting, right? People are really using their bodies to really advocate for justice, despite sort of thinking about the impact this pandemic could have, and just really seeing those things as being important and holding those two things to be valuable at the same time. So just looking at the comments, somebody wrote, powerful, moving, inspire better actions for yourself. Yep, absolutely. Thank you for those comments. Any other reactions to seeing these images? Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. So the second photo feels inspiring, the first photo feels infuriating. I don't know if you feel comfortable sharing what may feel infuriating about that image, or if you'd like to, you can do that in the chat or decline to do that. So whatever you feel comfortable with, Sarah, or Sarah, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Okay, I saw you just wrote that your mic isn't working, but you can try. We can give you a minute and see if you're able to, but if not, that's okay. We can take your comments in the chat. So just looking at your comment, the idea that the image is admirable, but at the same time, maybe the media sort of using that to create, it sounds like a narrative that may be problematic or feel maybe like missing the fuller picture, I think is what I'm getting from what you're saying. Yeah, thank you. So the idea of almost like adding additional burden to the protester. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, especially through writing. I know it's tough to type fast as the questions are coming in. Yeah, thank you for that point of view. Like, yeah, absolutely. So almost the sense of feeling like there's an additional burden being placed on the protester, and really holding that as well as we think about that. Yeah, thanks. Any other thoughts or reactions? And if anybody wants to share, feel free to unmute. So we'll just give you a second to do that. All right, so maybe we'll go on and move to the, oops, sorry, hold on, I spoke too quickly. Oh, thank you for your comment. You mentioned that it helps to restore a tiny bit of hope, lost from the bridge photo. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, again, something that we struggle with in making sure we're really highlighting some of the issues, but also recognizing that, again, there's so much nuance here, and how do we hold both things to be true, especially when we're really feeling some of the hopelessness from some of the things that we're seeing and hearing about. So we want to go ahead and start making the transition to talking a little bit about the impact on the community. So this is the third C, and really talking about systemic racism. So we wanted to highlight some of the impact on Black and Indigenous people of color, and really talking about specifically the intersection between class and racial and ethnic identity, and seeing how the current and future impacts of climate change and COVID-19 and racism are impacting these communities more significantly, right? Again, this could be a conversation we could have for a much longer period, but we wanted to just highlight some really important aspects. So recognizing that marginalized populations tend to be more exposed to environmental risks at higher rates than more white and affluent communities, higher rates of exposure to environmental toxins and climate-related diseases. And then, of course, again, because all of these things really overlap, the quality of healthcare and access to healthcare may not meet those needs and be tailored to those needs. So even as we're having conversations around what healthcare can look like and making sure everybody is covered, this ends up really being important when we think about the impact that has on these communities. Living in locations and buildings where extreme weather may continue to be impacting those communities, especially as climate change continues. And then just recognizing that there's limited attention sometimes paid to address some of the environmental injustices. And of course, encountering consistent racial injustice and systemic racism continues to add additional burden to poor communities of color. And of course, there are other aspects of identity too that are impacted by all of the things that we're talking about today. So I'm going to go ahead and let Marian talk a little bit more about that in terms of thinking about racial trauma as well as adverse childhood experiences. Sorry, Marian, I think you're not unmuted.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Thanks. So when we think about racial trauma, we're talking about the physical and psychological symptoms that people experience after exposure to a stress. And I'm going to say the exact same sentence that Dr. Mark said when she talked about eco-distress, which is, it's not a psychopathology, it is a normal stress response to a real threat. So I just want to emphasize here that the responses are symptoms. And it's very important to recognize that the causes are the underlying trauma of experiencing racial harassment or institutional racism or witnessing racial violence. Next slide, please, Betsy. So there's a lot to unpack in this slide, but just starting with the top half where it says adverse childhood experiences, and it describes what some of them are. I want to just say that there have been a multitude of studies around this, and they've found that over 60% of people in the United States report that they've experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. And often these adverse experiences occur together, and their effects are additive. So the more you have, the worse it is for your mental and physical health. And they have lasting effects on health, including chronic illnesses, as well as early death. So there's a direct correlation between adverse childhood experiences and premature death. So a lot of the research has looked at this as an individual level variable, looking at each individual and what experiences they may have encountered in their lifetime. But just keeping in mind that these don't always occur on an individual level, which brings us to the next level, which is the community environment level. So adverse childhood experiences occur in adverse community environments. And in relation to what we're talking about today, the climate, the COVID, and the racial injustice, these are all collective traumas. They're not individual traumas, although individuals do experience them to a greater extent or lesser extent. But these are traumatic collective events that are ongoing and are being experienced on a global scale. So we need a different kind of a model than just the individual model to understand these. And people at the Center for Community Resilience have developed this model of the pair of ACEs, where the more individual type, the adverse childhood experiences, are paired with adverse community environments, which include discrimination, lack of opportunity, poor housing, violence, the communities where people live. And in addition, some child mental health professionals are working to include climate change as one of the ACEs. So trying to bring climate into this discussion as we think about the health effects, as Dr. Mark described, some of the direct and indirect health effects of climate change are similar to some of these adverse community environments. So this tree illustrates the relationship between the two. And by asking the question, what's in your soil, communities can begin to set goals and implement policy changes that can build community resilience. So that's the idea behind this, that it's useful to think in this model in order to create change. So when we think about the loops, the powerful feedback loops that exist between the interconnected systems, for example, adverse childhood experiences are traumatic and they constrain a child's brain development. This then in turn leads to poor decisions and poor behaviors, which might lead to addiction and violence and other kinds of health problems. Climate-generated toxic stresses like a heat wave, a drought, even hotter temperatures, as we heard before, create direct effects on aggression. They also create disruption of lifestyle and homelessness. And then homelessness becomes the community environment, which then affects increasing childhood adverse experiences. So there's this constant feedback loop between all these different factors, and it could be seen as a vicious cycle. But the people at the Center for Community Resilience are saying that collecting data and informing people can actually lead to what they call a virtuous cycle. So by intervening at any point in the system, you affect other points in the system. So I think that's also where the motivation comes to act. You can act at any point because the system is all interconnected and it will have effects on other factors within the system. So in the next slide, we're going to look at more detail at some of these interactions between climate, COVID, and race that can increase vulnerabilities among individuals, families, and communities, with the idea that we're looking at this to collect information about how we might intervene in a public health model. So first, we recognize that regions with higher levels of air pollution also have higher death rates from COVID-19. So right there, there's an interrelation between climate and the coronavirus. Secondly, communities of color have experienced the highest death rates from the coronavirus, as well as higher levels of job loss because of the economic effects. Right there, we see that interaction between communities of color and the pandemic. What are the reasons for these higher rates of illness and death among communities of color? We need to investigate so that we can intervene. So we've been told by researchers, especially, I'm quoting here from Dr. Golden at Johns Hopkins Centers for Public Health and Diversity. One is living in crowded conditions. Obviously, if you're living with 10 people in an apartment and a small, space, it's impossible to implement social distancing measures in the same way as if you have more space. So the rates of infection are then going to be higher. More people of color are working in essential fields as essential workers. So they have a higher rate of exposure to infection. And then they're also faced with the difficult choice of exposing themselves to a health risk or to an economic risk and risking the economic stability of their families. There's also inconsistent access to healthcare in poorer communities due to lack of health insurance or underinsurance. People can't always afford a doctor visit. They can't always afford medication or equipment to manage diseases that they already have. And this then creates an additional vulnerability to exposure to the coronavirus. So chronic health conditions are also, we know, much higher amongst people of color for the same reasons, that living in stressed communities and polluted communities, they have higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, lung disease. All these are underlying medical conditions. And the CDC has told us that about 90% of those hospitalized with severe COVID-19 have an underlying medical condition. So that raises the chances for people of color to have more severe reactions to COVID. Also, immunity is affected by chronic stress. So people who live in chronically stressed conditions, their body's ability to defend itself against disease is impacted by that. So they might be more vulnerable, not only to chronic disease, but also to infectious disease. So one key to improving equity is gathering data on all of this, race, ethnic, and neighborhood-specific data, knowing who is affected by COVID-19 and who's bearing the most burden is critical in addressing the imbalances in testing and in treatment. So one of the possible responses would be public health strategies and policies, like setting up a testing site in a community that has very high rates. Instead of having people not have access to the healthcare, test them more frequently, and also provide public health messaging, like culturally appropriate messaging, reducing the stigma associated with the disease, and translating messages into different languages for immigrant communities as well, so that it's more accessible. So those are just some of the ways that people are working on these factors and points at which intervention might be helpful. Thanks. Betsy, you can advance the slide.
Thank you, Marian. I love this quote of Sam Grant from 350.org, Minnesota. Um, and I love it paired with this classic picture from psychology, right? If you look at the picture, you can see either the profile of two people looking at each other in the black, or if you focus on the white, you can see the goblet, right? So I think this illustrates Sam Grant's point that as we start to look at these issues, I, for one, like, you know, we like to think about things in compartments, as our human brains like to do. And what we're talking about is thinking about at least these three things and all the little variables within these things all at the same time. We're trying to think of how they all affect each other, and we're trying to think of solutions. And our brains want to kind of make it just one. I'll think about climate, I'll think about race. But the answer is, as Marion was talking about in the ACEs picture, that if you keep a sense of the whole and you start to intervene on one point with a sense of the context of the whole, then that's where you start to get some action. So really training ourselves and thinking about these problems to have a good toggle switch, and to recognize that that's really the end point, is to always be thinking about this in a very 360 sort of way. And that, yes, we're going to our brains want to think about one thing or one action, and that's okay. But we can really inform that action when we realize the large context and all the interconnections. I think working just on climate, or working just on COVID or structural racism, and leaving other people to do the other work without thinking about it, is like trying to build a house when everyone has different design plans. Like, it won't really hold firmly, it won't hold together. So I like the idea of the toggle switch as we go back and forth, and realize that our goal is to try to see both images at the same time. And I'll put COVID in with the climate part of this image, since COVID is an endpoint of the same earth destructive and consumerist policy that we humans have been involved in, that has led to that particular pandemic. Thank you, Botsi. So lots of reasons that we don't jump into ACT on any of these things. As we stated here, it's overwhelming problems. We don't know what to do. If we really making a change means really big topsy-turvy changes in our individual lives and in our lives as a political system and a culture. And I think that another way of looking at these three problems that I, for one, find very helpful is to think of them using a social policy term, thinking of them as wicked problems. These are problems that are so large, so interconnected, so many moving parts, so many people involved, that we can't use standard problem-solving methods to fix them. So we can't fix them in the usual ways, and we also can't soothe ourselves about them in the usual ways. We can't just go to bed tonight, it'll be better in the morning. It probably won't be. So thinking about these problems is something that will need creativity and kind of a radical kind of way of thinking about it is helpful on the one hand. On the other hand, I think we need to hold the fact of the human stress response. We don't like uncertainty. We are wired to feel bad when we don't know what's going to happen or what to do. When we feel scared like that, we get rigid and clamped down, and we make fear-based individual decisions and community decisions. So here I'm saying, all right, we need a lot of creativity and innovation to really jump into this kind of complicated thing. And I believe that. And I also believe that we can do that as individuals and as species, but we're going to need to really learn and expand and appreciate that we'll need new individual, a kind of internal activism. I like to think about it, activist in terms of how do we keep our homeostasis? How do we take care of our internal environment? How do we remain sustainable in terms of our bodies, minds, and spirits? as well as external kind of activism in whatever way we define that. So there's lots of reason we don't act, but I think, and there's barriers, but I think that there are absolutely ways to jump over those barriers with intention. Next slide. So what are some of the things we can do? We're in the early stages of figuring this out, at least in terms of mental health professionals, in terms of how do we cope, how do we manage this changing world and all these problems. One important thing that everyone involved in this kind of research and looking at it comes back down to is we need to understand our stress response for all these stressors. We need to appreciate how quickly it gets activated, whether with acute or chronic stressors, and how it is bad for us, how it changes our thinking, but how actually with really some basic kind of repetitive skills, we can modulate the stress response. Going on to point 2, self-regulation skills. So I don't mean like being a good person and sitting in the corner quietly. I mean things like regulating our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Breathing techniques, belly breathing are magic in terms of quickly resetting the nervous system, calming the mind. You still may be facing something that's terrible and painful, but you will feel more able to cope and more fully able to think. Number 3, thinking about what matters in life, like what are we here to do on earth? What do we value? This will be very individual and it will be culturally individual as well. But thinking about values, which leads to meaningful action, this helps tremendously with coping and resilience. And also, by the way, makes a difference in that complicated wheel Marion talked about. We need to jump in somewhere. The critical thing is to keep moving and moving in a meaningful way, moving as individuals, and point 5, or point 4 and 5 with community. And I think it is just important to highlight again, everybody comes to all these problems with different vulnerabilities on many levels. And the answers to what's going to be meaningful and what resiliency is going to look like is going to be different and should be respected. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Beth. I think that's really helpful as we talk a little bit more about resiliency approaches. So I'm going to reinforce some of the things that Beth shared, but also expand on some specific ideas as well. Just following up on Beth's last comment around making sure that we keep moving. I was also just reflecting on how, especially thinking about racial injustice, part of our movement can be to sort of, give up some of our privilege and sort of move out of the way. And I think that is true in all 3 pandemics, right? If there's ways that your movement is, potentially hindering progress, just really thinking about what that movement with others can start to look like. So thank you so much for that comment, Beth. So just thinking a little bit about resiliency approaches and really thinking about how to continue to bounce back and recover. Again, we've talked a lot about just all the different stressors that are going on, the different ways that there's impact on us. And again, just really wanting to reinforce that as people, how do we continue to build our resilience so that we can continue to move forward, as Beth was saying, and having really good, mental health sustenance in order to do that. So we're just going to share some suggestions here on some resiliency approaches, and the references that we have used in compiling this list are included in one of our slides, so you will see that shortly if you want to read more on that. So as Beth mentioned earlier, just really thinking a lot about how to continue to be in community with each other. That is one of the things that we know is often really, really important, is making sure that you're continuing to build connections and attachments with others and not really moving away from each other. So we know that that is really, really important as we're thinking about continuing to endure and sustain a lot of the stressors that we're currently experiencing. I think there's also so much importance in realizing that, life is about change. And sometimes I think we like to feel like we can control things because that helps us feel better. But most times there's so much that can be outside of our control. And then of the things that we can control, really seeing that process as something that can continue to change, and really thinking about how do we need to adapt in ways that will allow us to meet the challenges of today, as opposed to sort of firmly staying in how things were in the past that may not be as helpful for our coping. It's also really important in thinking about some of our coping strategies, right? So thinking about how to take really small action and setting goals that feel like they can be accomplished, and allow you to sort of feel like you are moving forward in the ways that are important to you. I really liked how Beth talked about the internal and external activism, in that, you know, for each of us, that's going to look really different. We don't all need to do the same thing. But as Beth and Marion were saying, if we can sort of tackle a part of the problem as we're acknowledging the larger whole of the problem, then that is part of what is needed. And setting small goals for yourself and doing that is so important. The same is true when we think about what specific coping strategies can look like for each of us. That can involve engaging in mindfulness or meditation, or as Beth was saying, some breathing, but also even just as basic as, you know, healthy eating and sleeping, as that's possible. And again, this is part of why when we talk about how, you know, access to resources does not impact us equally, if some in our community do not have access to food, right, that is something that we all need in order to build resilience. So how do we sort of think about that from a community perspective, and making sure that everybody in our community is nurtured, as well as ourselves, right? So thinking a lot about not just our own coping strategies, but thinking about how that's important for other people to take care of themselves as well. There are also just, again, some additional things that I know when we were talking earlier about values, as Dr. Mark was sharing, one of the values that I think we share in sort of getting into this field is making sure that we are alleviating suffering, and that can feel like such a big goal. But really thinking about, on a personal level, if I had to think about a small goal for myself, is making sure that I don't get desensitized to the suffering of others, right? So even as hard as it is to look at the images or to engage in some of the dialogues around COVID or racism or climate change, it's so important that you know, we're not desensitized to the suffering of others. Because again, I think that's a way we can sort of lose sight of the whole picture, and then lose sight of how we can actually intervene in order to support other people within our communities. Some additional approaches that we'd like to recommend are really thinking about how to nurture a positive sense of self. I think one of the things that, again, is so great about working with students is you really get to see a development around an identity of having coped sometimes with difficult challenges, and really getting to nurture that and recognize that. And I think for each of us, you know, we've all gone through difficult things in the past. What are some of the things that we have learned, and how has that helped us to cope? And realizing that our capacity to cope is deep, but how do we continue to nurture that? And then how do we not lose sight of some of those stressors that have caused that need to cope, right? So just kind of keeping, again, both things to be true at the same time. Again, thinking about what self-discovery looks like. I think especially when we think about all three pandemics, but specifically with racism, there's so many things that we need to learn. There's so many things that we need to grow from, and really thinking a lot about how do we sort of unlearn so many of the messages that we've gotten about, you know, racial and ethnic backgrounds, and, you know, what it looks like to trust one group and not another, right? So really thinking about how to unlearn some of those messages that we have received. Again, reinforcing the idea of the importance of, you know, post-traumatic growth, that sometimes we can experience something that's difficult and emerge from it transformed and having grown from it, and really thinking about what that can look like for each of us. And of course, each of us right now are experiencing a lot of challenges around how do we continue to grow, how do we continue to learn and nurture ourselves. And again, last but not least, thinking about our core values and letting those guide us through adversity. As I had mentioned earlier, just how I think about and how we all think about in this field about, you know, suffering, like, and making sure that we are not, you know, desensitized to that, but really attuned to it. And how do we continue to think about what small ways we can work towards that, and not losing sight of that. So again, these are just some suggestions, and when we talk in the question and answer, maybe we can talk more in detail about that, but just wanting to make sure we leave a little bit of time for that too. Beth is just going to share some of the resources available here. And again, we're going to share some references before we open it up for questions.
Yeah, these are just three good books to look at, three of the things we've been talking about. The Emotional Inflammation is a good self-care, sustainability, internal activism way to manage all kinds of stress. It's a very good how-to manual. Probably many of you know about the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's definitely a book well worth reading. And the Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, I think I can't see the, this is a recent book. I just took a look at it and it looks really good. Again, highlighting a lot of what we talked about, but really building on it and enriching it. And it's really helpful. And you'll see the links to a number of different information resources. And at the top is Nature RX. Thank you, Botsi, because this is a place to look for reminders and ideas that Mother Nature is still trying to take care of us, even as we are not doing a good job taking care of he, her, they, them, but that there's some ways even here on campus or not on campus to really plug into the ways that being outside or access to nature can be very, very helpful for our health and our mental health. Was there another slide, Botsi, or that's it?
So we're just going to share a quick slide of the references. If you need to just take a photo of that or keep it, of course, we can share this as well. But we wanted to provide some references. Some were included in the slides, but these were some of the other ones we've used as well, just in case you'd like to read a little bit more. So I'll leave that on for a minute or so, just in case you'd like to take a screenshot of that. And then we're going to open it up to questions. So very soon we're going to stop sharing the slides and allow more of a dialogue for the next 15 minutes or so before we wrap up today. And thank you, Elizabeth, for your comment. And just going to go back to the other slide. These are our email addresses. Of course, feel free to reach out to us. If you go to the CAPS page, you'll see our names, and if you click on our names, you'll be able to email us that way as well. But just in case you want to get those as well, feel free to reach out to us. So we're going to go ahead and stop sharing the slides. Any questions, any comments, anything come up for any of you, feel free to unmute if you'd like, or of course, write in the chat.
I'll just go ahead and ask, thank you all so much for putting this event on. I feel like you all at CAPS are always asking people how they're doing and how they're coping, but I don't know how often you get asked that question. So I'll just push it back to you. How are you all doing? And maybe if you could talk about some of the coping mechanisms that you all are using for all of these various pandemics, as you referred to them.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. That's a great question. Marian and Beth, would either of you like to go first, or would you like me to?
I'm trying. Thank you, Elizabeth. I guess just my initial reaction, I was thinking again of the every act of care and kindness is helping push the wheel of all these problems. So thank you so much for your kind question. And in terms of what I'm doing, I will say that doing talks like this, spending this time with you all here, having Climate Week at Penn, I mean, the more, I guess it has to going back to that balance of thinking about what matters to me and finding people who I can engage with in that action and keeping moving and recognizing that there are times and days where I just, again, I go through, it's too much, I need to stop, trying to kind of find my window of tolerance. And then when I feel I'm too tired, I'm too whatever, I go watch Netflix that night. So I think, really trying to be intentional about practicing, I guess, what we're preaching today, that's helping me.
I could go next. Thanks, Elizabeth. I feel like also trying to keep a balance. Some of the things that Betsy mentioned and Beth too about, spending some time in nature is always helpful, and doing my own personal yoga practice and mindfulness practice is helpful for coping. And then I think engaging in these issues as well, trying to move the policies that would be beneficial in whichever ways we can, encouraging people to vote, just being active in the communities that I know and that I can try to touch. Helps, I think, to at least do a little bit to move towards a vision that I think would be better vision for all of these interrelated things about, the pandemics that we're facing right now.
Yeah, again, thank you for that question. I think the first thing that came up for me was, I think for me, setting realistic expectations for myself. I think when the problem feels big, as all three do, I think there's a temptation to feel like then I need to come up with like a big like intervention that I'm in charge of and I need to execute it and bring it to fruition, which of course, as we've mentioned, like that's completely, not the best approach. Like we need to be thinking about doing it in community. So, in the interest of transparency, Beth and Marian are more experts around climate change than I am. So I feel like I'm still learning a lot about that. But at the same time, I think recognizing, I think as Beth was saying, like my internal activism and my external activism and figuring out like, okay, what are the expectations that I can set for myself that do not lead to me feeling burnt out or discouraged or overwhelmed, but allow me again to sort of keep moving in a way that allows me to honor some of my values as opposed to feeling this pressure to have to figure out everything. And then I think the other thing is, especially when the COVID pandemic was starting, just recognizing some of the fear that I was sitting with and noticing that when I'm in a fearful place, that also leads me to not taking action because again, I feel, overwhelmed by what's happening. So I think recognizing sort of how I'm feeling and then how to sort of sit with those feelings, but also not get paralyzed by them. And I think especially when I think about racism, I think there's so much of it that can make you feel, completely demoralized, right? Or disheartened and feel like, okay, is there really change happening? And it's like, yes, and maybe slow. And maybe with all three things, it's going to be slow change, but that doesn't necessarily mean there is no movement. And I think just recognizing that and then just feeling inspired by the things that people are doing. again, I think it's so important to sort of recognize what my lane is and think about the change that I want to make in my lane. And I think that's also helped a lot as well. But I think there's been a lot of feelings, and I think, again, being in CAPS community, but also my community outside of CAPS, and spending time with family and at times unplugging has been helpful. But yeah, thank you for that question again.
Thank you all. That was really helpful.
Any other questions at all, or any comments? It doesn't have to be a question at all. If you have any thoughts or something that maybe we did not cover as clearly.
Does anybody want to share about how they're coping besides the three of us? It's an interesting question. Thank you for that question. Or any other resources that we didn't mention?
Yeah, so if it looks like there are no other comments, Beth and Marion, is there anything you would like to add before we transition out?
No, just thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.